London, the Savoy Hotel, 8:30 p.m. An 8-year-old girl with a torn dress and a face dirty with mud approached the entrance of the city's most exclusive restaurant. The security guard, James Thompson, stopped her with a dismissive gesture. "You're too dirty to come in here, child. This place isn't for people like you." The little girl looked at him with eyes that seemed to contain pain too great for her age. What James didn't know was that this dirty child was Charlotte Wellington, the sole heir to an industrial empire worth $2 billion, missing for 3 days after fleeing from her mother's funeral. And what was about to happen would change both their lives forever, proving that sometimes appearances deceive in the most devastating way possible. London's autumn of 2023 had painted the capital in golden hues that reflected off the glass facades of the skyscrapers in Canary Wharf. London breathed wealth and ambition at every corner, from the glittering boutiques of Bond Street to the futuristic towers that challenged the English sky. It was a city that never stopped, where time was money and appearance was everything. On this cold November evening, the Strand gleamed like a precious showcase in the heart of Westminster. The Savoy Hotel stood majestically between Georgian mansions and modern corporate headquarters, an oasis of luxury where aristocratic past merged with contemporary opulence. Its golden lights filtered through ancient wooden shutters, creating a fairy tale atmosphere that attracted the international elite like honey attracts bees. Inside the restaurant, Britain's financial aristocracy dined among Waterford crystal and Sheffield silver. Each table told a story of power. Here, a cabinet minister discussed multi-million-pound contracts. There, a media mogul sealed deals that would change the future of European industry. Conversations intertwined in elegant whispers, punctuated by the clinking of Dom Perignon flutes and the rustle of Savile Row suits. This was the temple of London capitalism, where a single handshake could be worth more than a small nation's GDP. In this sanctuary of wealth, every detail was perfected, from waiters in white tie who moved like silent dancers, to bouquets of rare orchids that perfumed the air with exotic essences, to contemporary artworks that adorned the walls like modern benedictions. James Thompson guarded this earthly paradise with the pride of a yeoman warder defending the Tower of London. At 42, he embodied the perfect British social metamorphosis, from working-class son to guardian of the most refined establishment. His life's journey had been a relentless climb towards respectability, starting from the council estates of East London, where he'd grown up between the smell of Sunday roast and dreams of a better life. James's uniform was as immaculate as a guardsman's, gold buttons polished each morning, trousers with a razor-sharp crease, black shoes that reflected the lights like mirrors. But it was his bearing that told the real story, the straight back of someone who had earned his place in the world, the confident gaze of someone who knew society's unwritten rules and applied them with military precision. For James, the Savoy wasn't just a workplace. It was tangible confirmation that the meritocratic system worked. He was living proof that with effort and dedication, one could change social class, forever leaving behind the smell of sweat and toil from the factories to breathe the refined perfume of success. Every evening, when he saw industrialists in thousand-pound suits stepping out of their Bentleys, he felt part of that world, even from his position as humble guardian. His philosophy of life was simple and inflexible. There existed a natural order of things, a social hierarchy that must not be disturbed. The rich were at the top because they deserved it, the poor at the bottom due to their failings. And he, James Thompson, was the keeper of this cosmic balance, the man who decided who could access the paradise of the privileged and who must remain in the purgatory of mediocrity. That evening, while observing the elegant ballet of Rolls-Royces, Bentleys and Jaguars depositing glittering passengers before the entrance, James felt particularly satisfied with his role. The cold November air bit sharp, but he was warm in his position of power. protected by the certainty of being in the right place at the right moment in history. It was in this moment of self-satisfaction that he saw emerging from the shadows a figure that seemed to belong to another universe. A girl of about 8 was slowly approaching the hotel, and each step she took seemed to increase the stark contrast with her surroundings. It was as if two parallel worlds were about to collide at the Savoy's golden threshold. The girl's dress told a tragic story without need for words. It had clearly been an expensive dress, probably bought at one of those children's boutiques in Harrods, where prices start at figures James earned in a week. But now this floral dress was reduced to dirty rags, stained with mud and tears, torn in several places as if it had survived a war. The girl's chestnut hair was disheveled and matted, stuck to her head with dampness and lack of care. Her small, delicate face, which must once have belonged to a pampered princess, now bore the marks of the street. Cheeks hollowed by hunger, eyes ringed with exhaustion, skin dirty with that gray patina known only to those who sleep rough. But it was her eyes that told the most devastating story. Green eyes like emeralds, large and expressive, that seemed to have seen too much pain to belong to a child. In that gaze was an ancient sadness, an awareness of suffering that should never touch childhood innocence. It was the look of someone who had lost everything and was still trying to understand why the world had suddenly become so cruel. Charlotte Wellington carried on her shoulders the weight of a tragedy that would have broken even an adult. She was the last heir of an industrial dynasty that had forged modern Britain, the daughter of Victoria Wellington, the woman who had transformed a small Yorkshire steel mill into an international colossus, employing 100,000 people across 3 continents. The Wellington family story was an epic saga of British capitalism. Charlotte's grandfather, Sir Arthur Wellington, had begun in 1953 with a small foundry in Sheffield, working 18 hours a day with hands that cracked from the heat of the furnaces. His son Edward had transformed that artisan activity into a modern industry, expanding into special steel and precision engineering. But it was Victoria who, marrying Edward and becoming the first woman CEO of a British steel group, had taken the company into the Olympics of global economics. With a strategic vision that combined feminine intuition with ruthless entrepreneurship, she had diversified investments into renewable energy, aerospace technology, and luxury property. Under her leadership, Wellington Industries had become a $2 billion empire that influenced the economy of half of Europe. Charlotte had grown up in this world of absolute privilege, but also enormous responsibility. From an early age, her mother had explained that with wealth comes the duty to improve the world, that money is a tool to create well-being, not just to accumulate luxuries. Victoria had raised her daughter with solid values: respect for those who work, generosity towards those who have less, humility despite privileges. Their life had been a perfect balance between opulence and normality. Yes, they lived in a $20 million penthouse overlooking Hyde Park, traveled by private jet, and had a country estate in the Cotswolds. But Victoria had always ensured Charlotte attended a state school, helped with the company's charitable works, and understood the value of money by seeing up close those who didn't have it. The first blow of fate had come 2 years earlier, when Edward Wellington died in a tragic plane crash, returning from a business trip to New York. Charlotte still remembered that cursed afternoon. She had come home from school and found her mother sitting on the drawing room floor, still in her business suit, crying while watching the evening news announcing the tragedy. From that moment, Victoria had to be simultaneously Britain's most powerful CEO and a single mother raising a child in grief. Charlotte had watched her mother transform into a warrior, fighting every day to keep an empire standing, while her heart bled from losing the man she loved. Board meetings alternated with maths homework, international press conferences with bedtime stories. For 2 years, mother and daughter had formed an invincible team. Victoria had protected Charlotte from everything, creating around her a bubble of normalcy and love that kept her safe from the pressures of the business world. Charlotte, in turn, had become her mother's secret strength, the reason Victoria found the energy to get up each morning and conquer the world. But cancer doesn't look anyone in the face, not even the most powerful women on the planet. The diagnosis had come like a bolt from the blue. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage, guarded prognosis. Victoria had fought like a lioness, submitting to the most innovative treatments, flying to the best hospitals in the world, spending fortunes to find hope. But the disease had been stronger than her iron will. The last months had been a calvary that transformed the most feared woman in boardrooms into a fragile and emaciated figure. Charlotte had witnessed her mother's physical disintegration without ever losing hope, reading her books during chemotherapy, holding her hand during sleepless nights, whispering that everything would be fine, even when both knew it wasn't true. Victoria died on a Tuesday morning in October, while rain fell outside and London awoke unaware it had lost one of its most illustrious daughters. Charlotte was with her, had felt her mother's last breath, had seen those eyes that had always protected her close forever. In that moment, at 8 years old, Charlotte Wellington became Britain's richest orphan and the loneliest child in the world. The funeral had been a state event. Westminster Abbey overflowed with powerful figures from around the world who had come to pay homage to Victoria Wellington. There were ministers, captains of industry, ambassadors, artists, intellectuals. Everyone wanted to be seen at the final farewell to the woman who had changed the face of British industry. But Charlotte, sitting in the front row dressed in black like a premature widow, felt only the deafening emptiness left by her mother. The official speeches seemed false to her. The shoulder pats from company executives annoyed her. The whispers about her future inheritance disgusted her. Everyone spoke of Victoria as a symbol, an icon, a legend. No one spoke of her as the mummy who made her pancakes on Sunday mornings. When the Archbishop began the final homily, Charlotte could no longer bear this farce. She stood up from her seat, ignored the whispered calls from legal guardians, and ran out of the abbey while everyone was focused on the ceremony. No one followed her immediately, too caught up in protocol and the importance of the event. When they finally noticed her escape, Charlotte had already vanished into London's labyrinth. For 5 days, Britain's richest child lived like any orphan on the streets of her city. She slept in doorways in Covent Garden, under Thames bridges, in hidden corners of Camden. She ate what she found in bins, drank water from public fountains, washed in station toilets. In those days, she learned things no child should ever know. That hunger is physical pain, that gnaws at your stomach, that November cold penetrates your bones when you have no bed, that adults look at you with suspicion when you're dirty. But above all, Charlotte discovered a terrible truth, that being a billionaire on paper means nothing when your heart is poor in everything that matters. All the money in the world couldn't bring back her mother, couldn't erase her pain, couldn't make her feel safe again. Wealth had become an unbearable burden, a mark that separated her from the rest of the world instead of protecting her. During those sleepless nights on the street, Charlotte thought back to her mother's words, "Money is a tool, not an end. What really matters are the people you love and who love you." Now that the people who loved her were dead, what use were those billions? She was just an 8-year-old girl with a bank account she couldn't even imagine, but with no one to hug her when she had nightmares. On the 5th evening of her flight, while wandering aimlessly through central London, Charlotte found herself on the Strand. The golden lights of the Savoy hit her like a punch of nostalgia. In this place, she had lived some of the happiest moments with her mother. Special birthdays, dinners after award ceremonies, afternoon teas when Victoria wanted to spoil her a little. She remembered every detail of those encounters, the scent of fresh flowers at the entrance, The maître d' who always smiled at her and gave her a special chocolate, the waiters who treated her like a little princess. In that restaurant, she had felt loved, protected, special.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
It was the symbol of a time when the world still made sense. In her desperate child's mind, this place represented more than just a restaurant. It was a portal to the past, a refuge where she might perhaps find a piece of her mother, a trace of the love she had lost. She didn't think about money or her social status. She thought only of the desperate need to feel safe again in a world that had become too big and frightening. As she approached the entrance, Charlotte didn't notice the disgusted looks from elegant guests stepping out of their luxury cars. She didn't realize how much her appearance clashed with the Savoy's refined environment. She was just a child seeking home, hoping to find a small corner of paradise in a hell she didn't deserve. James saw her coming when she was still 20 meters from the entrance, and immediately every fiber of his being went on alert. A child reduced to such conditions in front of London's most prestigious hotel? It was a scenario that violated every principle he believed in, an intolerable dissonance in the perfect luxury symphony he was called to protect. His first impulse was visceral disgust. He looked at Charlotte and saw everything he hated: poverty that soiled beauty, disorder that threatened harmony, weakness that contaminated strength. In this dirty child he saw the ghost of his past, the memory of what he had been before conquering his privileged position. James positioned himself in front of the entrance door like a gladiator in the arena, muscles tense and gaze hard. He was ready for confrontation, determined to protect his world from this small intruder who represented everything he had spent his life fighting. He didn't see a child in difficulty. He saw a threat to the established order. When Charlotte arrived before him, James felt confirmation of his deepest convictions. The child was visibly dirty, malnourished, dressed in rags. She was the perfect embodiment of what happens when you lose control of your life, when you fall from social grace. She was living proof that there are people who don't deserve to be in places like the Savoy. The clash was inevitable and devastating. James stopped Charlotte with words that came from the depths of his prejudices. "You're too dirty to come in here, child. This place isn't for people like you." His voice was loaded with all the contempt that a lifetime of class struggle had deposited in his heart. But Charlotte wasn't an ordinary child. Despite her young age and the terrible circumstances she was living through, she carried in her blood the DNA of a family that had built empires and challenged conventions. She raised her gaze to James with a dignity that would have honored a queen, and for a moment he glimpsed something in those green eyes that should have made him think. It was a look that spoke of pain too great for a child, of premature wisdom forged by suffering, of an inner strength that no external appearance could hide. For a fraction of a second, James had the opportunity to see beyond the surface, to recognize the noble soul hiding behind the torn clothes. But the opportunity was wasted. James was too blinded by his self-proclaimed moral superiority to catch that signal. He continued his verbal attack, speaking about Charlotte's mother in terms that would have been offensive to anyone, but which, for an orphaned child, were daggers to the heart. James's words were like acid poured on an open wound. Charlotte had just lost the most extraordinary mother in the world, a woman who had fought cancer with the strength of 1,000 lionesses, who had built an empire from nothing, who had dedicated every breath of her life to her daughter's well-being. Hearing this ignorant guard speak of Victoria with such malice was a pain that added to all the other pains. But Charlotte didn't explode, didn't cry, didn't rebel. With a composure that came from the depths of her aristocratic upbringing, she simply corrected James with royal dignity. Her mother, she explained with a firm voice despite everything, had been the kindest person in the world. Then, without adding anything else, she turned and disappeared into the London night like a ghost of offended nobility. James remained in front of the Savoy's entrance with the feeling of having won an important battle. He had protected his world from external contaminations, had maintained the social order he considered sacred. The hotel's guests could continue dining in peace, knowing there were still men like him guarding their serenity. He couldn't imagine that he had just committed the most monumental error of his existence, an error that would make his world of certainties collapse, like a sandcastle swept away by the wave. The child he had chased away wasn't just any poor unfortunate, but Britain's richest heiress, the daughter of the country's most powerful industrialist, the de facto owner of the very hotel in front of which he stood guard. The awakening came the next morning with the brutality of a falling guillotine. James opened the newspapers to read the sports news and found himself facing a front page that froze the blood in his veins. Charlotte Wellington, heiress to $2 billion, missing for 6 days. Hunt for Britain's richest orphan. Charlotte's photo was everywhere. Not the dirty and desperate child from the previous evening, but a little princess in a white ceremonial dress, with a radiant smile illuminating a clean and combed face. But they were the same identical green eyes that James had looked at with such contempt, the same eyes that now stared at him from the pages of every British newspaper, silently accusing him. The article was a punch to the stomach that took his breath away. Charlotte Wellington, 8 years old, sole heir to Wellington Industries, the industrial giant that controlled steel mills, power plants, airlines, hotel chains. A fortune estimated at $2 billion that made this child one of the richest people on the planet. She had disappeared after her mother Victoria Wellington's funeral, the legendary CEO who died of cancer at the young age of 35. James sat heavily on his kitchen chair, feeling the world spin around him like a mad carousel. This dirty child he had chased away like a stray dog was Charlotte Wellington, heir to an empire that employed 100,000 people across 3 continents. Wellington Industries owned, among other things, a luxury hotel chain that included some of Europe's most prestigious establishments. Charlotte was technically one of his employers, a person who, with a simple phone call, could have not only fired him, but erased his entire professional existence. But the economic realization was only the first layer of much deeper devastation. As he read the article, James began to reconstruct the true story of what he had seen the previous evening. Charlotte had lost her father 2 years earlier, had witnessed her cancer-stricken mother's slow agony, had become an orphan at 8, while carrying an emotional burden that would have broken even an adult. She had fled the funeral because she could no longer bear the falseness of the adults surrounding her, because she needed to process her grief away from the world's eyes, because at 8, she didn't know how to handle such great pain. For 6 days, she had wandered through London like any abandoned child, sleeping on the street, eating from rubbish, living the most traumatic experience a human being can face. And when, in her desperation, she had come seeking comfort in a place that reminded her of happy times with her mother, he had chased her away with words that now seemed monstrous to him. James realized he had added cruelty to already unbearable suffering, had denied help to the one who needed it most in the world, had failed as a human being in the most spectacular way possible. The consequences were immediate. Dismissal on the spot, reputation destroyed. But James discovered there were deeper pains than losing a job. He couldn't sleep, haunted by the memory of those green eyes. He had a daughter the same age as Charlotte, and guilt was devouring him. He began searching for Charlotte throughout London, selling everything he owned to survive during the search. After 2 weeks, he found her under Waterloo Bridge, huddled between the pillars, her face gaunt, and eyes that had lost all hope. The encounter was heartbreaking. James knelt before Charlotte, words coming with difficulty from his throat. He asked her forgiveness for what he had done and for what he represented, a world of adults who judge without knowing. Charlotte looked at him for a long time, and in that silence James felt the weight of all his prejudices. When Charlotte spoke, Her words were of a wisdom that shouldn't belong to an 8-year-old child. She explained that she felt poor despite the billions, because true wealth was her mother's hugs, bedtime stories, the feeling of being loved. James brought Charlotte back to her guardians, refusing any reward. But before parting, Charlotte made him a promise that changed his life. When she grew up, she would create a place where everyone could enter, even if they were dirty, even if they were different. The years that followed were of radical transformation for both. James had to rebuild his life from scratch, accepting humble jobs he would once have considered beneath his dignity. He found work as a caretaker at a primary school in South London, where every day he had before his eyes the miracle of childhood innocence and adults' responsibility to protect it. In that new role, James discovered a vocation he didn't know he had. He became the secret confidant of the most difficult children, the one who could recognize behind the mask of aggression the cry for help from those who suffer. His experience with Charlotte had taught him to look beyond appearance, to always seek the hidden story behind every behavior. Charlotte, meanwhile, grew up surrounded by the best guardians and advisors, but never forgot that night under the bridge and the man who had come to find her to ask forgiveness. At 13, when British law allowed her to have a voice in family patrimony decisions, she made the choice that would define the rest of her life. The Charlotte Wellington Center for Children in Need opened in 2028 in a rundown area of South London that the council had tried to regenerate for years without success. Charlotte bought an entire block of abandoned buildings and transformed them into a magical village where children without families could find not just shelter and food, but above all the certainty that someone believed in them. The center was a work of social art, colorful classrooms for learning, creative workshops for expressing talent, sports fields for releasing energy, gardens for cultivating hope. But above all, it was a place where no child was ever judged for what they had been through, where the only rule was that everyone deserved a second chance. On Inauguration Day, Charlotte gave a speech that moved not only London, but all of Britain. With the firm voice of someone who had known pain and chosen to transform it into love, she spoke of how she had learned firsthand that sometimes, when you're dirtiest on the outside, it's because your heart is bleeding inside. She explained that the center existed to prove that everyone deserves an open door, especially when the world seems to have closed all the others. And when it came time to introduce the center's security manager, Charlotte called James Thompson to the stage. The man who 5 years earlier had chased her from the Savoy now had the most important job in the world, ensuring no child would ever again be judged by appearances, that every little one who crossed that threshold would feel welcomed and loved. James took the stage with tears in his eyes, before an audience of international journalists, politicians, and benefactors. He looked at Charlotte, who had now become a young woman with determination in her eyes and generosity in her heart, and understood he had received an undeserved gift, the chance to transform his greatest mistake into life's most important mission. In the months that followed, the Charlotte Wellington Center became a model for all of Europe. Delegations from around the world came to study the innovative method that combined social assistance, excellent education, and psychological recovery. But the true secret of success was the atmosphere of unconditional love that could be felt in every corner. James dedicated himself body and soul to his new role, welcoming each child as if they were the most important in the world. He had learned the most precious lesson, that a person's value is never measured by how they appear on the outside, but by the pain they carry in their heart and the love they need to heal. The story of Charlotte and James became legend in London, told in schools as an example of how forgiveness can transform even the greatest mistakes into opportunities for growth. And every time someone entered the Charlotte Wellington Center, they could read on the golden plaque at the entrance the words the young founder had chosen as her manifesto. In here, only what you have in your heart matters, not what you wear. If this story has touched your heart, if you've understood that we must never judge by appearances, then share it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that will make you think. Comment: have you ever judged someone completely wrongly? And now, click on the next video to discover another story that will change how you see the world.